Welcome to the Evangelism Podcast. I'm Daniel King, and I am excited about telling people about Jesus. Today I have a very special guest with me, Louis Alexander from the Great Commandment Network. Thank you for being on the podcast with me.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you are a discipleship expert. Let's start, if you could just tell me, what does the Great Commandment Network do?
Oh, well, we partner with churches and ministries, denominations around the Great Commandment, loving God and loving others, and then fulfilling the Great Commission, which we think the Great Commandment is in the Great Commission, where Jesus said, make disciple makers and teach them to observe all that I've commanded you. And we think the Great Commandment is something that was the starting point, to love God, and perhaps even the starting point for evangelism is to love God. The heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love our neighbor as ourselves.
Now, sometimes Great Commission and Great Commandment have kind of been separated, but I think we really need to include both in what we're thinking about. And then sometimes people separate evangelism and discipleship. Like you say you're an evangelist, and they say, well, what are you doing to really disciple people? But every discipleship begins with evangelism.
Absolutely.
And so we really need both. We need good evangelism, but then we also need to take the people that respond to the gospel message and begin to raise them up in the things of the Lord. And you have actually done some really deep thinking on the discipleship process. You're part of the Empowered 21 Discipleship Commission.
Yes.
And over the last 12 years, you guys have been working to define spirit-empowered discipleship and what that looks like. And kind of talk to me about the process and how you've been developing this.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you for those questions. We started with the Ephesians 4, 11 and 12, that God gave some as apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, for the works of service, the works of their ministry. And so we kind of started with the premise, Daniel, that saints serve. And so we took that word serve, and we looked at the Greek and Hebrew words throughout the scriptures. And there were a couple of Hebrew words that we drilled down on, and the scripture verses in the Old Testament associated with them, and then several New Testament words. And we did a cluster analysis, and they clustered around 4 dimensions that a disciple, because we wanted to explore, what would a disciple look like if one showed up. And
so you're trying to define what good discipleship looks like.
Yes.
And how to help people grow. And so by clearly defining this, then you can measure different areas where maybe a church or ministry is being successful in discipling people, and then other areas where they need to work on.
Yes, because we were thinking our former perspectives on discipleship wasn't really working. We weren't making disciple makers, who make disciples. And so a lot of the models, discipleship models, were more of a rational behavioral methodology, and we found that not being effective. It wasn't spirit empowered. So we ended up starting with the premise that these need to be relational. The Great Commandment is very relational. Love God, love your neighbor. That's very relational. That they could only be fulfilled could only be fulfilled through spirit empowerment. There isn't any of our outcomes in there of like a disciple memorizes scripture, because you could be a lost person and memorize scripture. Now we're going to imply that memorizing scripture is necessary, but these outcomes, we wanted to make sure they were spirit empowered, and certainly as we do evangelism, we want to be led by the Spirit and empowered by the Spirit, because it's a work of the Spirit in which people come to Christ. So that was important to us. And so they clustered around these 4 areas of loving the Lord, when we did this cluster analysis of the word for serve, loving the Lord, or serving the Lord, serving His Word, ministering the Word, serving and loving people, ministering to people, and serving His mission.
Okay, so you have these 4 different areas that you are evaluating. So you've got loving the Lord, living his word, loving people, and living his mission. And under each one of these different categories, you have 10 outcomes of what it would look like to be successful for someone to grow in those areas. All right, so let's start with the first one, loving the Lord. What are some of the outcomes that you're looking for under loving the Lord?
So, for example, I'll talk about L2, which we call loving the Lord, and discipleship outcome number 2 of learning to listen to and hear God. And certainly, in evangelism, I want to be listening to the Lord. I mean, just give you a couple of biblical anecdotes, of Jesus when he tells his disciples, we must needs go to Samaria. And Jews didn't do that. And that word must needs, die in the Greek, delta epsilon iota, means in the King James is translated must needs. We got to go. I'm listening to and I'm hearing my Father, and he's saying go through Samaria. And Jews didn't do that. But so right off the bat, Jesus is challenging some of the assumptions of his disciples, and they're going to Samaria, and he's hanging out by a well, as you would know, Daniel, and this woman comes, and so he's waiting on a woman, and listening to the Lord, waiting on a woman. And she comes, and he has this conversation with her, and the John 4 passage. And I'm sure it was a shock to the disciples because apparently, rabbis don't really talk to women, but apparently this one does. But listening to and hearing God, and the Lord will guide us. I mean, Jesus was walking through Jericho, and he stops at a tree and looks up, and it's Zacchaeus, and he welcomes him down. The welcome mat's out, and arms open, and but I think that came from, and he said again, that used that same Greek word, we must needs go to your house, and so we think that Jesus is listening to and hearing God, and that's probably an important outcome that we would.
All right, so all that is under L2, listening to and hearing God for direction and discernment. And so you would want people to grow in that as they go through the discipleship process. So some of the different categories that you would have or outcomes that you're looking for under loving the Lord would be practicing thanksgiving in all things, experiencing God as he really is through deep intimacy with him, rejoicing regularly in my identity as his beloved. And so you've got 10 outcomes there. And then the second area is living the Word. What are some of the outcomes that you're looking for under living the Word?
So we kind of sometimes talk about, I'll put my glasses on here so I can read, do the book. So I'll just talk about W2 for a minute there, which is the outcome number 2 under the Word, living the Word, being a living epistle, so that we're, people are reading our lives, Daniel. So hopefully they're going to be feeling the vibe from me of this guy is a safe guy. If I'm sitting by you on a plane and we're having a conversation, you feel safe and you feel like you can trust me and we can have this conversation. And I've led people to Christ on airplanes just by trying to have this vibe of being a living epistle, of wanting to know and care about them, in my life. And I remember, can I share a little anecdote with you? So I was on a plane from Charles de Gaulle, Paris, flying to Istanbul, and it's about a 4.5 hour flight. And I had done it, several times, and so I know what I'm in for. You got to sit there, and you don't know who's going to sit by you. And so having some of these human interest questions, like, tell me one of your most celebratory days. And so I'm sitting by this guy named Mutlu, and he's a Turkish businessman. He'd been selling forklifts in Paris, and I know I'm sitting by him for 4.5 hours, so I want to show interest in his life, try to bridge to the gospel somehow. And so I'm just asking him. I said, "Hey, what? Tell me about your, one of your most celebratory moments in your life." And so here again, this is a Muslim guy. He's from Turkey, and I'm an American Christian. So we're worlds apart, and in terms of worldview. But I asked him, tell me about a time of rejoicing, and he tells me about when he got engaged to his wife. And he, you know where he met her? He met her in a supermarket.
Wow.
And, I mean, all of a sudden, this kind of Me Too moment of, man, you know, guys in the States try to pick up chicks in the supermarket too, you know? And he got her phone number in the line, and you know, they went out and they dated for a couple years. You know, he brought her back to that same checkout line and proposed marriage to her. And I mean, so he spends 45 minutes telling me this story. And, you know, and I'm showing interest. I'm giving him eye contact. I'm listening. You know, I have a smile on my face. I'm rejoicing with him. You know, I'm doing the Bible verse of, you know, Romans 12:15. I'm trying to make a human connection. And so I'm trying to be a living epistle of Romans 12:15. And after 45 minutes, he said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I teach people how to love each other. And he was he couldn't believe it. He was like, what? And so I was able to just kind of tell him about why I do that and the love that Christ has for me, and I'm the beloved of God. And he was coming from obviously a Muslim background and the Quran, and I told him Jesus stories. I spent, you know, probably an hour or so just telling him Jesus stories, and he was so intrigued. He had never heard about Jesus even washing his disciples' feet, things like that. And I seeded the gospel. He didn't pray to receive Christ that day, but he got a heavy dose of gospel. And that came from trying to be a living epistle on the plane.
Wow, that's a great story. I really like how you've broken these 40 discipleship goals down into different outcomes that you're looking for. So how do you measure if someone is growing in these areas?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Right now we have a self-assessment of a Likert scale of 1 to 5. You know, we're going from, you know, I strongly disagree to I strongly agree, and you just sort of self-identify where you would score yourself. And
sometimes just asking the question makes people realize, like, hey, I could grow. I need to grow in this area.
Yeah. And then, you know, once you can identify that, you know, you're growing your self-awareness of identifying, oh yeah, you know, I need to work at learning to listen to and hear God, and maybe I need to ask God more. You know, God, lead me. Who today can I share my faith with, and lead me to opportunities, and see if the Lord is prompting you. But the more we start, you know, bringing that to top mind, and I start moving the needle, you know, from maybe a 2 that I disagree that I'm listening to and hearing God, to maybe I move it to a 4 that, you know, I'm agreeing. I'm more consciously aware of that in my life, and I'm trying to do that more.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. If someone is interested in finding out more about what you do or more about the Great Commandment Network, what is your website?
Yeah, it's greatcommandment.net, and you'll find a bunch of resources on there.
And tell me a little bit more about what the Great Commandment Network does.
Okay. Yeah, we're a resource training ministry, and we partner with denominations and movements around the Great Commandment, Great Commission.
Yeah.
And so we provide resources to address freedom, adequacy, motivation in fulfilling the Great Commandment, Great Commission. You know, sometimes I may want to do that, but I may have freedom issues. I may have my own fears. I may have unresolved pain. Or sometimes it's adequacy. And so we create these resources. We have a lot of online resources.
You have complete courses that people can go through and learn about all this, and also how they can implement discipleship in their life and in their ministries.
Yeah.
Well, Brother Lewis, thank you so much for being on the Evangelism Podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you for asking me.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it, Daniel.
Daniel King is on a mission to save 1 million souls a year, but he can't do it alone. Would you consider sowing a financial seed today? To give, please visit www.kingministries.com.